This is Module 6, and we're going to talk about World War II. Module 6 is entitled World War II and the Rise of American Globalism, 1941 to 1945. Now, you will remember that the 1930s was a period of transformation in terms of Americans abandoning their isolationism and turning towards internationalism. But it was really World War II that transformed the United States into the dominant global power of the world. And so we need to talk about some of the events that made that possible. First of all, with regard to Japan, we're going to start and actually end with Japan, because it starts, of course, with Pearl Harbor. And as the Kayla book mentioned, during the 1930s, the interests of the United States and the Japanese Empire became irreconcilable. And that was partly because of the new leadership in Japan, the militarists who, were convinced that Japan could not, through peaceful trade and diplomatic negotiations, extend her or supply herself with the resources that she needed, and could not find emigration for the excess population, but needed military conquest in Manchuria, by dominating the Chinese mainland, and by expanding down into Southeast Asia, into the areas that were being colonized by Britain and France and Holland. And so when the United States began to impose sanctions on Japan after her aggressive expansionism, the Japanese concluded that the Americans were trying to strangle the Japanese Empire, and they had no choice but to go to war, although many of the Japanese generals were very apprehensive about taking on the USA. But they felt that in order to survive, they had no choice. Now, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and then they turned and took over the Philippines and French Indochina and Singapore and parts of the British Empire, the Americans devised a grand strategy, and of course, shortly after the United States declared war in Germany, we declared war in Japan, we declared war in Germany as one of the Axis powers. But Roosevelt and his generals both decided that they were going to focus on Europe. It was the Europe First strategy. So in terms of the European war, of course, there were the big three: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill were pretty close together, ideologically and culturally on the one hand, and on the other hand they faced Joseph Stalin, the Russian communist, who was very different. But even between Roosevelt and Churchill there were significant differences. Churchill was primarily concerned with preserving the British Empire, and Roosevelt was concerned with Wilsonian principles, and at the same time, he was also concerned with promoting American businesses in the world, and he could see that there was going to be a lot of opportunities for American overseas investment in the post-war world. So that was, it was not just strictly human rights and democracy, but there were economic motives in World War II as well. Churchill was much more anti-communist than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was apprehensive about communism, suspicious about communism, but it was really Churchill that was really strongly suspicious of Stalin's motives. And Stalin was very suspicious of Churchill's motives. Stalin saw Churchill as someone who was really kind of plotting against him. And so the principal issue between the big three in Europe was opening up a second front. And Stalin wanted the Allies to immediately attack the Western European coast, whereas Churchill said, no, let's go in through the back door, through what he called the soft underbelly, by invading first North Africa and then going up through Italy. And so the British and the Americans invaded North Africa, and then began, after a British defeat at Tobruk, and then the British retook Tobruk with American help, the Anglo-Americans began to move up the Italian peninsula. A very hard, brutal campaign In 1943, Mussolini was overthrown. The Germans tried to reinstate him. The Italians rose up again, and this time they executed Mussolini by executing him by hanging him in the middle of the street. But the Germans continued to try to protect and keep Italy under fascism. But meanwhile, of course, on the Eastern Front, the Russians were pushing westward back into Germany. Now, your book mentions, the Kaler book mentions, three major phases of World War II. The period when the Germans invaded Poland, second period when they invaded Western Europe, and the third period in which the Soviet Union and the Americans joined in. I'm basically looking at this in two phases: the rise of fascism and the fall of fascism. Now, in the rise of fascism, the high tide was 1942, in which the tide began to turn. In the Far East, it was the defeat of the Japanese Navy at Midway, which was just west of Hawaii, and in Europe, it was the counterattack of the Russians. Hitler, Panzer Blitzkrieg didn't work in Russia for a variety of reasons that are described in your reading, and the Russians counterattacked. Hitler failed to take any major German city. He failed to take Leningrad or Stalingrad or Moscow. And the Russians then, with their huge numbers, counterattacked. And so it was really the Russian army that was responsible for destroying the Wehrmacht. The Battle of Britain was a critical battle, but it was between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. But the bulk of German army soldiers were taken over, were either killed or captured by the Russians. And so the Russians really felt that they had payback coming to them because they had played a major role in the war. Then, of course, finally the Allies did open up a second front on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, which was American, British, and Canadian, and Australian, and slowly began to push the Germans back. Back through northern France, through Belgium and Holland, into Germany, across the Rhine, and Roosevelt told Eisenhower to stop at the Elbe River and to allow the Soviets to take over Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany. Now, there were five wartime conferences that you should know about. The Atlantic Conference, the Atlantic Charter Conference in 1941, the Casablanca Conference in 1943, early in 1943, the Tehran Conference in late 1943, the Yalta Conference in the spring of 1945, and finally the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And basically, the face of post-war Europe was decided at those conferences, especially at Yalta and Potsdam. Meanwhile, the island hopping campaign in the Far East began to push push Japan back towards the home islands. And of course, the Japanese had a intense, fanatical desire to defend not only their island but their emperor, so there was a really strong desire to prevent the Allies from taking over their country. But it was really the Americans who defeated Japan by dropping the bomb. So I want you to read about the pros and cons of dropping the bomb. But in addition to saving American lives and saving Japanese lives, there was a strong desire to bring the war in the Far East to a swift end before the Russians could get into it. Because Roosevelt and the Americans, by this time Truman and the Americans, did not want to see Japan partitioned the way Germany had been partitioned. And so in the Far East, the United States was completely supreme. So was MacArthur was the supreme Allied commander. So by 1945, then the war was over. There had been enormous destruction, some 40 to 60 million people, depending on which statistics you use, of whom 6 million Jewish people had been systematically just murdered by the Nazis. And so it really, the murder, particularly the Holocaust, really showed the viciousness of German fascism. And so in the post-war world, there were, it was a determined effort not to repeat the mistakes of the past and never to have another world war again by a series of international agreements. Some of those things were implemented. Many of the ideals of the Second World War were not. And so, in many ways, the previous struggle against the Axis was replaced by the Cold War, which we're going to see in the next unit, Unit 7, Module 7.